The Oklahoma dust hung thick in the September air of 1944, turning the afternoon sun into a copper disk that seemed to hover just above the horizon. Staff Sergeant Daniel Kovac stood at the edge of the wire fence, watching the latest transport of German prisoners file off the trucks in a weary procession of gray uniforms and hollow stairs. Their boots, what remained of them, made a discordant symphony against the packed earth. The crack of split leather, the shuffle of cardboard insoles, the occasional metallic scrape where a heel had worn through to the nail bed beneath. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Fort Reno prisoner of war camp sprawled across the red Oklahoma soil like a temporary city, row upon row of whitewashed barracks arranged with geometric precision. The camp had swelled to nearly 3,000 German prisoners since D-Day. Men plucked from the fields of France and the ruins of Italy, transported across an ocean they'd once dreamed of conquering, now deposited in the American heartland where the corn grew taller than any man and the sky stretched so wide it seemed to mock the very concept of borders. Daniel noticed him immediately. A tall prisoner near the end of the line, perhaps 30 years old, with the rigid posture of career military despite the exhaustion that painted shadows beneath his eyes. The man's wear-mixed uniform, though filthy from weeks of transit, still bore the faded outline where sergeant's stripes had been removed. His boots were in particularly terrible condition, the left sole flapping with each step like a mouth trying to speak, held together by wire that someone had threaded through the leather in a desperate field repair. "Name's Hauptfeldwebel Klaus Zimmermann," Lieutenant Morrison said, consulting his clipboard as he walked up beside Daniel. Morrison was a thin man from Massachusetts, all sharp angles and clipped consonants, who treated the administrative duties of the camp with the same seriousness others reserved for combat. Sergeant Major, if we translated properly, captured near Cannes in July. Intelligence says he was a machinist before the war, Dresden originally. Daniel nodded, making a note in his own records. He'd been assigned to Fort Reno for 8 months now, ever since a piece of shrapnel in Tunisia had left his right leg carrying metal that set off every weather change like an arthritic barometer. The wound had ended his combat service but not his war work, and he discovered an unexpected aptitude for managing the complex human machinery of a POW camp, the delicate balance between security and dignity, between punishment and pragmatism. "The new batch looks rough," Daniel observed, watching as the prisoners were directed toward the processing building, a long structure where they'd be deloused, examined by medical staff, issued clean uniforms, and cataloged into the camp's elaborate record-keeping system. "Most of them have been wearing the same boots since 1942, Morrison replied. "High command supply lines have been shot to hell since before Normandy. Some of these fellas marched across half of France in footwear that wouldn't pass muster in a hobo camp." As if to punctuate the statement, one of the prisoners stumbled, his boot sole catching on an uneven patch of ground. He caught himself against another man's shoulder, and Daniel caught a glimpse of feet wrapped in what looked like strips of burlap where socks should have been. The processing took 3 hours. Daniel supervised the intake, watching as Army medics examined feet that bore the landscape of long marches, blisters layered upon blisters, toenails blackened or missing entirely, skin cracked and infected. One of the camp doctors, Captain Mary Chen, emerged from the medical tent shaking her head. 6 cases of trench foot in this batch alone, and more blisters than I can count. Whatever they've been walking on, it wasn't fit for human wear." Mary had been assigned to Fort Reno shortly after its conversion to a POW facility. She'd grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, fought her way through medical school at a time when most institutions wouldn't admit women, and possessed a clinical efficiency that masked a deep well of compassion. Daniel had seen her work 15-hour shifts, tending to prisoners and guards alike, never distinguishing between the uniforms when it came to medical need. "We'll need to issue them new footwear immediately," Daniel said. "Can't have them working the fields or the workshops in that condition." "Already drafted the requisition," Morrison replied, "but you know how supply moves. 'Twould be weeks before we get proper military boots in their sizes." That's when Corporal Jimmy Reeves spoke up. Jimmy was a local boy born and raised in Reno, just a few miles from the camp, with the kind of practical Oklahoma wisdom that came from generations of people making do with what they had. He'd been classified 4F due to childhood polio that left him with a pronounced limp, but he worked harder than men with 2 good legs, managing the camp's supply depot with an efficiency that bordered on wizardry. "Sergeant Kovac," Jimmy said, "I might have a solution. There's a warehouse full of civilian shoes, part of a war production board surplus. They were meant for factory workers in the defense plants, but the order got canceled when the plant converted to a different kind of production. Been sitting in Oklahoma City for 6 months. I know a guy in logistics who owes me a favor." Daniel considered this. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be provided with adequate clothing and footwear, but it didn't specify military issue. If civilian shoes would solve the immediate problem and keep the prisoners healthy enough to work the camp's various labor programs, it seemed like a practical solution.
"What kind of shoes are we talking about?" he asked. "Work shoes, mostly. Heavy leather, rubber soles. The kind of thing you'd wear in a machine shop or a factory floor. Some of them are pretty modern. Cushioned insoles, reinforced toe boxes. American manufacturing at its finest." "Get them," Daniel decided. "However many pairs you can secure. We'll distribute them tomorrow once the new prisoners are settled." The next morning broke clear and cool, one of those early autumn days when Oklahoma briefly remembered it was capable of mercy. The prisoners had been assigned to their barracks, fed their first hot meal in weeks, and given the night to sleep on real mattresses instead of the floors of cattle cars or the cold ground of transit camps. Daniel had noticed, as he always did with new arrivals, how the simple provision of clean water, warm food, and a safe place to sleep began to resurrect something human in eyes that had grown accustomed to seeing them as animals. The shoes arrived in a convoy of 3 trucks, stacked in boxes labeled with various civilian manufacturers: Red Wing, Wolverine, Thorogood. Jimmy had managed to procure nearly 400 pairs in various sizes, more than enough for the new arrivals, with surplus for the camp's existing population. Klaus Zimmermann stood in the distribution line with the other members of his barracks, waiting as American soldiers checked shoe sizes and handed out pairs. Daniel watched the German sergeant's face as he took in the scene. The casual efficiency of the Americans, the sheer abundance of new footwear, the matter-of-fact way in which their captors provided for needs that their own army had long since abandoned. When Klaus reached the front of the line, Jimmy glanced at his feet and retrieved a box containing a pair of dark brown work boots with thick rubber soles and leather that gleamed with newness. "Size 10½", Jimmy said in his halting textbook German. "Try them on, make sure they fit." Klaus took the shoes, turning them over in his hands with something approaching wonder. Daniel could see him examining the construction, the clean, machine-perfect stitching, the substantial sole that must have seemed impossibly luxurious compared to the wire and cardboard contraptions he'd been wearing. The German sergeant's fingers traced the cushioned insole, pressed against the reinforced heel. Then something shifted in Klaus's expression. His jaw tightened, and when he looked up, his eyes had gone cold. He said something in rapid German to the prisoners standing near him, and several of them laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. "What did he say?" Daniel asked Private Werner Fischer, one of the camp's translators. Werner was a second-generation German-American from Milwaukee, fluent in both languages, who'd been assigned to Fort Reno specifically for his linguistic skills. Werner's face reddened slightly. He said, "Look at the soft American shoes. No wonder they need machines to win their wars. They're too delicate to march on their own feet." Another prisoner picked up the theme. examining his issued pair with exaggerated disdain. "They're like bedroom slippers," he said in German, loud enough for his fellows to hear. "The Americans are so soft, they cannot even tolerate proper boots. They need cushions and padding like old women." The laughter spread through the line of prisoners, taking on an edge of derision that made several of the American guards stiffen. Daniel saw Jimmy's face flush with anger, watched Lieutenant Morrison's hand move instinctively toward his sidearm before he caught himself. Klaus Zimmermann held up his new shoes like evidence in a trial. "This is what we're fighting?" he called out in German, his voice carrying across the distribution yard. "Men who need their feet wrapped in cotton, who cannot bear the hardness of real soldiers' boots? Perhaps if they spent less time on comfort and more on discipline, they would not need half the world to win their war for them." The mockery continued as the prisoners returned to their barracks, many of them carrying their new shoes with theatrical reluctance, as if handling something contaminated. Heard fragments of conversation, comparisons to women's fashion, jokes about American weakness, speculation that such soft footwear would fall apart within a week of real work. "Sir," Morrison said quietly, his Massachusetts accent tight with suppressed anger, "permission to confiscate the shoes and issue standard military boots when they arrive. We don't need to tolerate this kind of insubordination." Daniel watched Klaus Zimmermann disappear into Barracks 7, still carrying his mocked shoes. Through the barracks window, he could see the German sergeant examining them again in the afternoon light, though whether genuine curiosity or continued scorn, he couldn't tell. "No," Daniel said finally. "Let them keep the shoes. Let them wear them for a few days. Sometimes the best response to mockery is silence and time." That night, Daniel walked the perimeter of the camp as he often did, finding a kind of meditation in the regular circuit of the fence line, the predictable intervals of guard towers, the geometric order imposed on the chaotic sprawl of human need and resentment. The Oklahoma sky blazed with stars undimmed by city lights, the same stars that shone over Europe, over the battlefields where men were still dying, over the ruins of cities that Klaus Zimmermann might have known as home.
He thought about the shoes, about the strange alchemy of contempt that could transform an act of provision into an insult. He'd seen it before in the camp, the way prisoners sometimes rejected kindness more fiercely than they resisted punishment, as if accepting comfort from their enemies would constitute a betrayal of something essential. Pride, maybe, or the need to maintain some inner resistance when all outer resistance had been stripped away. Mary Chen found him near the southwest corner, where the camp backed up against a field of sorghum that rustled in the night breeze like whispered conversations. "Heard about the shoe situation," she said, falling into step beside him. "Jimmy's pretty upset. Says he went to a lot of trouble to get those shoes, and the prisoners treated them like garbage. They're scared. Not of us, of what accepting kindness might mean. If we're not the monsters they've been told about, then what does that make them?" Philosophical for a Tuesday night, Sergeant. "Long war, Doctor." They walked in companionable silence for a while. Mary had a way of existing in quiet spaces that Daniel appreciated. No need to fill every moment with conversation, comfortable with contemplation. "I checked those shoes," Mary said finally, "out of curiosity. The construction is actually remarkable. Arch support, cushioned insoles, moisture-wicking lining. Designed for men who spend 12 hours a day on factory floors. The Germans have been marching in boots designed in 1939, probably produced in factories that prioritized speed over comfort. Their feet are a mess because their footwear has been inadequate for years." "So the shoes really are better." "Substantially. They'll realize it once they start wearing them. The body doesn't lie, even when pride tries to." Daniel wondered about that, about whether the body's truth could penetrate the armor of ideology and resentment. He'd seen prisoners maintain impossible positions through sheer force of will, refusing medical treatment that would save their lives, rejecting food when they suspected some kind of trick or poison. The human capacity for self-destruction in service of belief seemed limitless. But he'd also seen the slow erosion of certainty, the way small kindnesses accumulated like water against stone, eventually carving new channels in the hardest rock. Maybe the shoes would be part of that erosion. Or maybe they'd just be another thing for the prisoners to resent, another reminder of their defeat and dependence. "Guess we'll see," Daniel said. "Guess we will," Mary agreed. As they completed the circuit and returned to the main gate, Daniel noticed a figure standing alone near Barrack 7. Klaus Zimmermann, recognizable even in silhouette by his military posture. The German sergeant was looking up at the stars, and for a moment he imagined him calculating the distance home, measuring the impossible miles between Oklahoma and Dresden, between captivity and freedom, between the man he'd been and whatever man he was becoming. The word count notification appeared in Daniel's mind like a ghost. 2,143 words into a story that would need to stretch much further, into places he couldn't yet imagine, toward an ending that remained hidden beyond the horizon of this autumn night. Morning in Barrack 7 began at 0600 hours, when the American guards walked through ringing a handheld bell that sounded like something borrowed from a rural schoolhouse. Klaus Zimmermann had been awake since 5:30, a habit carved into his nervous system by 12 years of military service. He lay on his bunk in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the breathing patterns of 37 other men, cataloging them unconsciously, the wheeze of tuberculosis in the corner, the snoring of exhaustion in the bunk below, the restless turning of men whose dreams refused to release them. The new shoes sat beside his bunk, exactly where he'd placed them the night before. In the dim light filtering through the barracks windows, they looked almost obscene in their newness, their leather unmarred by wear, their laces crisp and white like something from a different universe than the one he'd inhabited for the past 3 years. "You're going to wear them?" The question came from the bunk across from Klaus, Gefreiter Peter Adler, a former postal worker from Hamburg who'd been conscripted in 1943 and captured 3 months later. Peter was 22 years old and possessed the kind of wide-eyed bewilderment of a man who'd never wanted any part of the war and couldn't quite believe he'd ended up in Oklahoma. "I don't know yet," Klaus replied in German, keeping his voice low so as not to wake the others.
They look comfortable. That's not the point. What is the point? Klaus didn't have a good answer to that question, which irritated him. He'd built a career on having answers, on knowing exactly what needed to be done and doing it with precision and efficiency. He'd been a machinist at the Zeiss factory in Dresden before the war, working with tolerances measured in microns, creating optical instruments that required absolute exactitude. The military had been a natural extension of that mindset. Orders given, orders followed, problems solved through proper application of procedure and discipline. But the shoes defied procedure. They sat there in their absurd perfection, mocking him with their comfort, challenging assumptions he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. The bell rang through the barracks, and men began to stir. Klaus rose from his bunk, joints protesting the movement. He was 31 years old and felt 60. The long march from Caen to the coast after his capture, the weeks in the British transit camp, the Atlantic crossing in a Liberty ship, the train journey across America, all of it had compressed into his bones like geological time, leaving him with the sense that he carried entire eras of exhaustion in his body. He reached for his old boots, then hesitated. His feet hurt. They'd hurt for so long that pain had become their normal state, a constant low-grade agony that he'd learned to partition into a separate mental compartment, acknowledged but not examined. The thought of forcing them back into those wire-stitched ruins made something in his chest tighten with rebellion. Almost against his will, his hand moved toward the new American shoes. "Aha," Peter said, grinning. "I knew it. Comfort defeats ideology every time." "Shut up, Adler." But Klaus pulled on the shoes anyway, his fingers fumbling slightly with the unfamiliar laces. The moment his foot slid into the first shoe, something happened that he hadn't anticipated. The cushioned insole seemed to embrace his foot, distributing pressure in a way that his old boots never had. The arch support, something he hadn't even known existed as a concept, cradled the center of his foot like a hand holding something fragile. The toe box provided room for his toes to spread naturally instead of cramping them into a narrow point. He laced both shoes and stood up. The sensation was so disorienting that he had to grab the edge of his bunk for balance. It felt like standing on clouds, like walking on the surface of the moon might feel if the moon were made of something soft and forgiving. His feet, which had screamed at him for every step for months, suddenly went quiet. "My God," he said before he could stop himself. "Good?" Peter asked. He took a few experimental steps. The rubber sole flexed naturally with his gait, absorbing impact in a way that leather and cardboard never could. He could feel the difference in his knees, in his hips, even in his lower back, as if the shoes were redistributing the entire mechanical load of his body in a more efficient pattern. He began, then stopped, unwilling to complete the sentence. Around him, other prisoners were making their own discoveries. Unteroffizier Hans Müller, a former factory foreman from Essen, was walking back and forth across the barracks floor with an expression of wonder on his weathered face. "I can't feel the ground," he kept saying. "I can't feel every stone and imperfection. It's like walking on carpet." Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, who had been a school teacher before the war and carried himself with the tired dignity of someone who'd seen too many of his students die, sat on his bunk, turning his new shoes over and over in his hands. "The construction," he murmured. "Look at the precision of the stitching. Every seam is perfect. They must have machines that can do this kind of work at scale." But not everyone was converted. Obergruppenleiter Franz Dietrich, a committed Nazi from Munich who wore his ideological certainty like armor, made a show of keeping his old boots on despite their condition. "I will not betray our soldiers by accepting American softness. Real men don't need cushions on their feet. The Wehrmacht conquered half of Europe in boots far harder than these." Several other prisoners nodded in agreement, though Klaus noticed that their eyes kept drifting toward the new shoes with something that looked like longing. Breakfast was served in the mess hall at 0700. Oatmeal, toast, scrambled eggs made from powder, coffee that tasted like burned dirt but was hot and plentiful. Klaus had spent his first week at Fort Reno in a state of disbelief at the abundance of food. Even as prisoners, they ate better than German civilians had in years, better than Wehrmacht soldiers had in the final months of the war. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They'd been told that America was on the verge of collapse, that the U-boat campaign had starved the country into submission, that victory was inevitable because German superiority would prevail over American decadence. But the food was real. The shoes were real. The camp itself, with its clean barracks and functioning plumbing and electric lights, was real. Reality kept contradicting the narrative, and Klaus found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to continuously revise his understanding of the world. After breakfast, the prisoners were divided into work details. The Geneva Convention stipulated that POWs could be required to work, but not in war-related industries. Fort Reno had adapted to this by establishing a variety of labor programs: agricultural work in the surrounding farms, maintenance of the camp itself, manufacturing of non-military goods in small workshops, even cultural programs where educated prisoners could teach classes or perform music. Klaus had been assigned to the machine shop, a long metal building filled with lathes, milling machines, and drill presses. The American Army needed various non-combat parts, replacement components for trucks and tractors, tools for construction projects, brackets and fittings for camp infrastructure. It was work that suited his skills, and he discovered an unexpected satisfaction in returning to the precision and focus of machining after years of military chaos. Sergeant Kovac supervised the shop, though his supervision was lighter than Klaus had expected. The Americans seemed to understand that skilled workers didn't need constant oversight, that micromanagement would destroy the careful concentration required for precision work. He'd set up the shop with surprising thoughtfulness, proper lighting, well-maintained tools, even a small library of technical manuals in both English and German. Klaus spent the morning turning a series of bronze bushings on a lathe, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of machine work, the calculation of speeds and feeds, the the smell of cutting oil, the meditation of watching metal transform under the cutting tool. His feet, in their new shoes, remained comfortable throughout. He found himself shifting his weight naturally, adjusting his stance without thinking, his body responding to the absence of pain in ways he hadn't realized it had stopped doing. During the mid-morning break, he stood outside the shop smoking a cigarette, American tobacco, provided by the camp, so much milder than the harsh German varieties that it was like smoking perfume. Private Fisher, the translator, was making his rounds, checking on the various work details. "How are the shoes working out, Hauptfeldwebel?" Werner asked in German. Klaus wanted to maintain his position, to defend the mockery he led the day before, but something in him had shifted, some small, truthful part that refused to lie about the evidence of his own body. "They're adequate," he said carefully. "Better than I expected." Werner smiled, and Klaus could see that the translator understood the significance of that admission, how much it cost to acknowledge even that small truth. "The sergeant wanted you to know that if the size isn't right, we have others. He said comfort isn't weakness, it's efficiency. A worker with foot pain is 30% less productive." Klaus considered this, the American pragmatic logic of it. Not morality, not ideology, just efficiency. He thought about the German military's attitude toward such concerns, the belief that suffering built character, that comfort made men soft. But what if it was backward? What if the willingness to accept unnecessary suffering was itself a kind of weakness, a failure to think clearly about what actually won wars? He didn't voice these thoughts. They felt dangerous, like the first crack in a dam that once started might bring the whole structure tumbling down. That afternoon, the prisoners were given recreation time. An hour when they could walk the campgrounds, play football with a makeshift ball, write letters home that would be censored and rarely delivered, or simply sit and exist without the structure of work or orders. Klaus found himself walking the perimeter, following the fence line much as he'd seen Sergeant Kovac do. The Oklahoma landscape struck him as alien and beautiful in equal measure. Dresden had been a city of Baroque architecture, elegant spires and the Elbe River winding through ancient hills. This was something else entirely. Vast horizons, red earth, vegetation that looked like it could survive anything. The sky was so enormous that it made him feel simultaneously insignificant and somehow liberated, as if the sheer scale of it rendered individual worries irrelevant. He passed the medical tent and saw Dr. Chen treating a line of prisoners with foot ailments. She worked with an efficiency that reminded him of German doctors, but without the coldness he'd come to expect. She spoke to each patient, in halting German supplemented by Werner's translation, asking about pain levels, explaining treatments, treating them like human beings rather than problems to be processed. One of the patients was Franz Dietrich, the Nazi holdout who'd refused the American shoes. His feet were wrapped in bandages, and even from a distance, Klaus could see the pain in the way he held his body. "Infection in both feet," Klaus heard Dr. Chen say. "You need to stop wearing those boots. They're causing more damage every day." "I will not wear American shoes," Franz replied stubbornly. "I am a German soldier." "You're a German soldier with gangrene starting in your left foot," Dr. Chen said bluntly. "Your choice is simple. Wear better shoes or lose toes. Maybe the whole foot if you're particularly stubborn about it." Klaus watched Franz's face work through the calculation, saw the moment when physical reality defeated ideological commitment. His shoulders sagged slightly, a white flag raised by the body against the mind's resistance. "Fine," he muttered. "Get me the shoes." Klaus continued his walk, thinking about the surrender he'd just witnessed. How many such surrenders happened every day? How many small defeats of certainty by the relentless pressure of truth? He thought about his own journey, from Dresden to North Africa to Italy to Normandy to here. Each step a kind of erosion, wearing away at the bedrock of his assumptions.
He'd believed in the war once. Not in Hitler particularly. Klaus had been too educated, too exposed to other ideas through his work at Zeiss, to fully embrace the crude mythology of Nazi ideology. But he'd believed in Germany, in the idea that his country had been wronged and deserved to reclaim its place, in the notion that military service was a noble calling. Those beliefs had carried him through the first years of the war, through victories that seemed to validate the enterprise, through the camaraderie of shared purpose. But the belief had died somewhere between El Alamein and Anzio, bled out in the sand and mud along with too many men he'd known. By Normandy, he'd been fighting not out of conviction, but out of habit, because stopping would have required confronting questions he wasn't ready to face. Capture had been a kind of relief, a permission to stop pretending that any of it made sense anymore. The shoes were part of that larger disillusionment. They were evidence that America, the country he'd been told was weak, degenerate, incapable of real military or industrial might, had somehow managed to design and manufacture footwear that was demonstrably superior to anything the vaunted German war machine had produced. And not just for officers or elite units, but apparently as surplus, so abundant they could give them to prisoners as an afterthought. What else had been lies? What other aspects of the grand narrative had been fabrications designed to sustain belief in an unsustainable cause? That evening, Klaus returned to his barracks to find a letter waiting on his bunk. The mail system at Fort Reno was erratic at best. Letters from Germany took months, if they arrived at all, routed through Switzerland and subjected to multiple layers of censorship. This one bore a Swiss postmark from August. He opened it carefully, recognizing his sister Marguerite's handwriting even before he saw the signature. The letter was brief, written in the careful, neutral language of someone who knew censors would read every word. Dear Klaus, I hope this finds you well and that the Americans are treating you according to the conventions. Dresden endures. The factory where you worked is now producing parts for aircraft. I should not say more. Mother passed in June. It was peaceful, as much as anything can be now. She asked about you at the end. I told her you were safe, though I had no way of knowing if this was true. I hope I did not lie. The city changes daily. What was beautiful becomes utilitarian. What was whole becomes broken. We adapt because there is no alternative. I think often of what you said before you left, about precision and tolerance. You were right that small errors compound into catastrophic failures. I see this everywhere now. Take care of yourself, brother. Come home when you can, though I do not know what home will look like by then. Your sister, Margaret. Klaus read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of what wasn't being said. His mother was dead. Dresden was being destroyed. The war his country had started was consuming everything, including the people and places he'd fought to protect. The bitter irony sat in his throat like broken glass. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where he kept his few possessions. Peter Adler watched from across the room, but had the wisdom not to speak. That night, Klaus dreamed of Dresden. Not the Dresden that existed in whatever form Marguerite had carefully not described, but the Dresden of his childhood. The Zwinger Palace with its Baroque pavilions, the Frauenkirche, rising like a stone prayer, the Elbe reflecting summer sunlight. He dreamed of walking those streets in shoes that didn't hurt, through a city that wasn't burning, towards a future that didn't end in Oklahoma dust. He woke at 300 hours, disoriented and aching with a homesickness so profound it felt like physical illness. He lay in the darkness, listening to the breathing of 37 other men who'd lost the same war, who dreamed the same dreams of cities and families that might no longer exist. The shoes sat beside his bunk, innocent and terrible in their implications. The transformation happened gradually over the following weeks, so slowly that no single moment marked the change. Klaus noticed it first in the small things. Prisoners who'd worn their old boots as a point of pride, quietly switching to the American shoes when they thought no one was watching. The derision that had characterized the first day faded into embarrassed silence, then into grudging acceptance, then finally into something approaching gratitude. Hans Müller, the factory foreman, approached Klaus one morning in the machine shop with an unusual request.
"I've been thinking about the shoes," Hans said, his voice low as if confessing something shameful. "The design, the materials. I worked in manufacturing before the war. I know what goes into making something like this at scale. The precision required, the quality control, the supply chains that have to function perfectly. We couldn't do this. Not in Germany. Not anymore. Maybe not ever." "What's your point?" Klaus asked, though he already knew. "My point is that we were lied to, about American capabilities, about our own superiority, about everything that mattered." Hans paused, choosing his words carefully. "I keep thinking, if they lied about shoes, what else did they lie about?" It was the question Klaus had been avoiding, the crack in the dam he'd felt widening with each passing day. Once you started pulling at the thread of deception, where did it end? If the Americans weren't weak and degenerate, if German engineering wasn't universally superior, if the promises of inevitable victory had been fantasies, then what had they been fighting for? What had all those dead men died for? "Everything," Klaus said finally. "They lied about everything." The admission hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Hans nodded slowly, then returned to his lathe without another word. But Klaus could see the way the man's shoulders had straightened slightly, as if speaking the truth aloud had removed some invisible weight. Sergeant Kovac called Klaus to his office in October, when the Oklahoma autumn had turned the prairie grasses gold and the air carried the first hints of winter. The office was a small room in the administration building, its walls covered with maps and duty rosters and the endless paperwork that characterized military life even in captivity. "Hauptfeldwebel Zimmermann," Kovac said, gesturing to a chair. His German was improving, Klaus noted, though he still carried the American accent like luggage. "Sergeant Kovac," Klaus sat, curious and wary in equal measure. "I've been reviewing the work output from the machine shop. Your production numbers are excellent. Quality is outstanding. Several of the parts you've made have been complimented by the officers who requisitioned them." Klaus waited. There was something else coming. He could hear it in the pauses between Kovac's words. "I wanted to ask you about something. A few weeks ago, when we distributed the shoes, you were vocal in your criticism. You called them soft, said they represented American weakness." Klaus felt heat rise to his face. "Yes, I remember. But you wear them now, every day. I've noticed." "They're practical," Klaus said carefully. "Better than the alternative." Kovac leaned back in his chair, studying Klaus with those steady brown eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "I'm not looking for an apology, if that's what you're worried about. I'm curious about something else. What changed? Not just about the shoes, but about whatever the shoes represent to you." It was a more perceptive question than Klaus had expected from his captor. He thought about deflecting, giving some bland answer that would end the conversation, but something in him was tired of deflection, tired of maintaining positions he no longer believed in. "I received a letter," Klaus said, "from my sister. My mother died in June. Dresden is—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't betray too much. "Dresden is not what it was." Kovac nodded slowly. "I'm sorry about your mother. She died while I was marching in France, wearing boots held together with wire, fighting for a cause that was already lost. I didn't know. I kept fighting because stopping would have meant admitting that it was all for nothing." "Was it?" Kovac asked quietly. "For nothing?" Klaus looked at the American sergeant, this man who'd been his enemy, and was now his jailer, and had somehow become something more complicated than either role suggested. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, I think it was. The shoes just made it obvious. If we couldn't even make proper footwear for our soldiers, what made us think we could conquer the world?" Kovac was silent for a moment, then opened a desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "This is against regulations," he said, pouring 2 small measures, "but I think we've earned it." They drank in silence, the Oklahoma sunset painting the office walls in shades of amber and gold. Klaus thought about precision and tolerance, about how small errors compound into catastrophic failures, about his sister's letter and his mother's death, and the city that was being consumed by the war they'd started. "What happens when the war ends?" Klaus asked. "What happens to us?"
"I don't know," Kovac admitted. "Repatriation, eventually? Back to whatever Germany becomes. But that could be years from now. The war in Europe might end soon, but the paperwork will take longer. And until then? Until then, we work. We survive. We try to be decent to each other, even when we're on opposite sides of the fence." Klaus thought about this, about the strange liminal space they inhabited. Not quite enemies, not quite friends, bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. "The shoes," he said. "They're excellent. Better than anything we made. I should have said so from the beginning." Kovac smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I know, but I appreciate you saying it now." Winter came to Fort Reno with unexpected ferocity, bringing ice storms that coated everything in crystal and wind that howled across the prairie like something alive and angry. The American shoes proved their worth in new ways. Their rubber soles gripped ice better than leather. Their waterproof construction kept feet dry through snow and slush. Their insulation provided warmth that the old Wehrmacht boots had never managed. Franz Dietrich, the Nazi holdout, died in December. Not from his foot infection. Dr. Chen had managed to save his feet, but from pneumonia, contracted during a work detail. He'd refused to wear the heavier American coat that was offered, insisting on his Wehrmacht uniform jacket as a point of principle. Klaus attended the funeral, watching as they buried Franz in the camp cemetery with full military honors, the American flag flying at half-mast out of respect for the dead, even when the dead had been their enemy. "He died for a uniform," Peter Adler said quietly as they walked back to the barracks. "For a symbol that didn't keep him warm. We all almost died for symbols. He just took longer to learn." Christmas came, and the Americans organized a celebration that left many of the prisoners in tears. There was a decorated tree, gifts of cigarettes and chocolate, a performance by the camp orchestra that played German carols alongside American ones. Sergeant Kovac made a speech about peace and human dignity that was translated into German by Werner Fischer, his words hanging in the cold air of the mess hall like a prayer. Klaus sat with his barracks mates, wearing his American shoes and eating food prepared by American cooks, listening to familiar melodies played by German musicians for an audience of prisoners and guards who'd temporarily set aside their roles. He thought about his mother, about Marguerite in Dresden, about all the Christmases that had been destroyed by the war. But he also thought about the possibility of other Christmases, future ones, in a world where men didn't die for symbols and shoes were judged by their quality rather than their national origin. The letter from Marguerite arrived in January 1945, just as news of the Soviet advance into Germany reached the camp through officially sanctioned newspapers and unofficially sanctioned rumors. This letter was longer, more desperate, the careful neutrality abandoned in the face of approaching catastrophe. "Klaus, they say the Russians are coming. The bombing continues almost daily now. The Frauenkirche still stands miraculously and defiant, but so much else is gone. I think of Mother's funeral, how we buried her in the old cemetery near the Elbe, and I wonder if even that grave will survive what's coming. I need you to know something, brother. I need you to understand that whatever happens, you were right to leave when you did. You were right about the war, about the lies, about the small errors that compound. Father used to say that precision in small things prevents disaster in large ones. We forgot that. We forgot everything that mattered. If you're reading this, you're alive and safe, which is more than most of us can say. Stay there. Don't try to come back until it's over. There's nothing here worth dying for anymore. Your sister." Klaus read the letter in the machine shop, his hands shaking slightly, the lathe running idle beside him. Sergeant Kovac appeared at his elbow, saw his face, and made a decision without asking questions.
Take the rest of the day. No one will mark it against you. But Klaus shook his head. No, I need to work. I need to make something precise and true. He spent the afternoon turning a series of aluminum parts for a construction project, losing himself in the meditation of exact measurement and controlled cutting. The machine hummed beneath his hands. The metal transformed under the cutting tool, and his feet remained comfortable in their American shoes. It seemed important somehow that he could still create things of precision and beauty, even here, even now, even as the city of his birth was being destroyed half a world away. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, the news arriving at Fort Reno on a warm spring morning when the Oklahoma sky was so blue it hurt to look at. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall to hear the official announcement, translated by Werner Fischer with tears running down his face. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war is over.
The silence that followed was profound and complicated. Relief mixed with grief, liberation tangled with loss. Klaus stood among his fellow prisoners and felt the weight of it all. The years of fighting, the cities destroyed, the millions dead, the future uncertain and terrifying. They'd lost. Everything they'd fought for had been for nothing. And yet he was alive. His feet didn't hurt. And somewhere in the ruins of Dresden, his sister might still be breathing. Peter Adler turned to Klaus with a question in his eyes. What now? Klaus thought about the shoes, about precision and tolerance, about small truths that accumulate into larger understanding. He thought about his mother's grave and his sister's letters, and Sergeant Kovac's quiet decency. He thought about Franz Dietrich dying for a symbol, and Hans Müller acknowledging the lies, and Dr. Chen treating feet without caring whose feet they were. Now we go home, Klaus said, and we rebuild, and we try not to make the same mistakes. Think they'll let us keep the shoes? Peter asked, a small smile breaking through the grief. Klaus looked down at his feet, at the worn but still functional American work shoes that had carried him through an Oklahoma winter, that had taught him something about the distance between propaganda and reality, about the quiet dignity of practical kindness over ideological purity. I hope so, he said. They're the best thing to come out of this war. Epilogue. Klaus Zimmermann returned to Dresden in the winter of 1947 after 2 years of processing and paperwork and the slow machinery of peace grinding through the complexities of repatriation. The city he found bore almost no resemblance to the one he'd left. The Baroque architecture had been reduced to rubble. The Frauenkirche was a collapsed ruin, and the Elbe reflected nothing but gray skies and gray buildings in a gray world. But Marguerite was alive. He found her in a cramped apartment in what remained of the Neustadt district, older and thinner and harder than he remembered, but alive. She wept when she saw him, and he wept with her, and neither of them spoke for a long time because words seemed inadequate to the distance they'd traveled. Eventually, she pulled back and looked at him, really looked, and her eyes moved down to his feet. American shoes, she said. It wasn't a question. American shoes, Klaus confirmed. They gave them to us in the camp. Best footwear I ever owned. La, only you would come home from a war talking about shoes. Father always said precision in small things prevents disaster in large ones. The shoes were a small thing that taught me about large ones, about what we got wrong, about what we need to get right. He wore those shoes for another 3 years, through the work of rebuilding Dresden brick by brick, through the establishment of the new optical factory where he returned to his machinist trade, through the slow process of constructing a future from the fragments of the past. When they finally wore out beyond repair, he kept them in a box in his closet, a reminder of lessons learned the hard way. Years later, when his own children asked him about the war, he would show them the shoes and tell them the story, not of battles and victories, but of pride and prejudice, of small truths that challenged large lies, of the moment when comfort defeated ideology and opened his eyes to reality. "Never be so certain of your beliefs that you ignore the evidence of your own feet," he would tell them. And in the evenings, when he walked the rebuilt streets of Dresden in whatever modern shoes the Workers' Republic provided, he would sometimes think of Sergeant Daniel Kovac and Dr. Mary Chen and all the Americans who'd treated him with more decency as a prisoner than his own commanders had shown as a soldier. He would think about the strange alchemy that had transformed enemies into something more complicated, about the ways that small kindnesses could crack the hardest certainties. The shoes had been just shoes, after all. Leather and rubber and thread, but they'd also been a door that, once opened, had changed everything. And Klaus Zimmermann, former Hauptfeldwebel of the Wehrmacht, machinist of Dresden, prisoner of Fort Reno, walked through that door and never looked back. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.